Welcome to the Revenge Diary.
My name is Maya Reyes, and I'm 29 years old. The call that changed everything for me came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2016. I was lying in my cramped studio apartment in Portland, Oregon, when my phone buzzed against the nightstand. The number was familiar, my uncle's landline from Sacramento. Maya, his voice was shaking. It's about your grandfather, They took everything. I sat up in bed, my heart already racing. What do you mean, everything? The house, the savings, even his car. Your mother and Rick, they convinced him to sign papers. Said it was for his own good, that they'd take care of him. But Maya, his voice cracked. They put him in some state facility 3 hours away. He can't even call us anymore. I was already reaching for my jeans before he finished speaking. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to see where our amazing community is watching from. Drop a flag emoji of your country in the comments below. Let's see how many different places we can represent today. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we share powerful true stories like this one every week. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you're ready to hear an unforgettable tale of justice and family loyalty. Now, let's get into the story. My grandfather, Antonio Reyes, had been the anchor of our family for as long as I could remember. A retired machinist from East LA who'd worked double shifts for 40 years to buy a modest 2-bedroom house in Sacramento's Meadowview neighborhood. The kind of man who fixed neighbors' cars for free, who grew tomatoes in his backyard that he'd press into the hands of anyone who visited. While my mother, Carmen, chased one get-rich-quick scheme after another and her boyfriend, Rick dealt in what he called business opportunities. Grandpa Tonio had been my constant. When Mom was too busy or too high to pick me up from school, he'd be there in his beat-up Ford pickup, windows down, mariachi music playing softly. When I needed help with homework, when I scraped my knee, when I had nightmares, it was always Grandpa who showed up. I'd moved to Portland in 2014 for nursing school, and every weekend I could afford it, I'd drive the 10 hours south to see him. We'd sit on his front porch, drinking café con leche and watching his neighbors' kids play in the street. He'd tell me stories about growing up in Boyle Heights, about my grandmother Rosa, who died when I was 3, about the factory where he'd met lifelong friends who still came by to play dominoes on Saturdays. Mija, he'd always say, family is everything, but familia verdadera, true family, is the people who stay when everything falls apart. I should have known something was wrong when Mom started visiting him regularly in late 2015. Carmen hadn't set foot in that house for 2 years, not since Grandpa had refused to cosign on another one of Rick's failed ventures. But suddenly, she was there every weekend, bringing takeout and staying for hours. She's changed, Maya, Grandpa had told me over the phone in January 2016. She says she wants to help me, make sure I'm taken care of as I get older. She brought all these papers from some lawyer about making things easier for me. I'd felt a chill then, but I'd pushed it down. Grandpa was 78, still sharp as a tack, still driving himself to the grocery store and tending his garden. But he was also trusting, especially when it came to family. Now, 3 months later, I was speeding down Interstate 5 at dawn, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Uncle Miguel, Mom's younger brother and the only other family member who still talked to Grandpa regularly, met me at a Denny's off Highway 99. Miguel looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past week. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. He slid a manila folder across the table to me. I got copies of everything from his neighbor, Mrs. Perez. She's the one who called me when the movers came. My hands shook as I opened the folder. Power of attorney documents, dated February 15, 2016. Property transfer agreements, bank account authorizations. All signed with Grandpa's careful, deliberate handwriting. She told him it was just paperwork, Miguel said quietly, to make sure his bills got paid, to protect the house from property taxes. Said she'd handle everything so he wouldn't have to worry. And Rick, Miguel's jaw tightened. Rick was the one with the facility recommendation, said it was temporary, just until they could get his affairs in order. The place is called Golden Years Care in Modesto. I tried to visit yesterday. They said he's only allowed approved visitors. Guess who's on the approved list? I stared at the papers, the words blurring as tears of rage filled my eyes. 40 years of work, of saving every penny, of building a life gone. Signed away in a few afternoons of manipulation disguised as love. "We have to get him out," I said. Miguel nodded grimly. "I already called legal aid. Woman named Janet Morrison is willing to help, but she says these cases are hard to prove. We need evidence that he was coerced or that he didn't understand what he was signing." I thought about Grandpa's voice on our last phone call, how confused he'd sounded when I asked about the papers. "I trust Carmen," he'd said. "She's my daughter, she knows what's best." That afternoon, I drove to the house, or what used to be his house. The windows were dark, the lawn already growing wild. A "for sale" sign stood crookedly in the front yard, the realtor's name printed in bold letters. Rick Castillo. My mother's boyfriend was selling my grandfather's home. Mrs. Perez, Grandpa's neighbor for 15 years, came out when she saw me standing there. "Maya, I'm so sorry." She was a tiny woman in her 60s, but her grip was surprisingly strong when she took my hands. "I should have called sooner, but it happened so fast." She told me everything. How Carmen and Rick had shown up with a moving truck on a Saturday morning. How they'd told the neighbors that Grandpa was too proud to ask for help, but needed to be somewhere safer. How they'd loaded his furniture, his tools, even the framed photos of Grandma Rosa, while Grandpa sat in their car looking dazed and lost. "He kept asking about his roses," Mrs. Perez said, pointing to the backyard where I could see the garden he'd tended for decades. "He wanted to wait until spring to transplant them, but they said there was no time." That night, I called Janet Morrison from my hotel room. She was a family law attorney in her 50s who specialized in elder abuse cases. Her voice was professional but kind when I explained the situation. "Unfortunately, this happens more often than people realize," she said. "Adult children who see their aging parents as a financial opportunity rather than family members who deserve protection and dignity. What can we do? We'll need to prove that your grandfather was either mentally incapacitated when he signed those documents, or that he was fraudulently induced to sign them through misrepresentation. Do you have any witnesses? Anyone who can testify about his mental state or about promises your mother and her boyfriend made?" I thought about Mrs. Perez, about Uncle Miguel, about the neighbors who'd known Grandpa for years and could attest to his sharpness, his independence. "I think so," I said. "Good. I'll file an emergency petition first thing Monday morning. We'll request a court-ordered mental evaluation and a freeze on all asset transfers pending investigation." But when Monday came, we discovered it was already too late. The house had been sold that weekend to a cash buyer, one of Rick's business associates. The proceeds, along with Grandpa's savings, had been transferred to an LLC registered in Nevada. I felt physically sick sitting in Janet's office, staring at the paper trail of theft disguised as family care. "They moved fast," Janet said grimly. "This was planned well in advance. But Maya, this doesn't mean we're defeated. It means we're dealing with people who knew exactly what they were doing." That afternoon, we drove to Golden Years Care in Modesto. The facility was a converted motel painted institutional beige, surrounded by a chain-link fence. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and weeds. This was where they'd put a man who'd owned his own home, who'd worked his entire life to avoid depending on anyone. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, barely looked up when we asked to see Antonio Reyes. "Visiting hours are Sundays only, approved visitors only. You need to be on the list." "I'm his granddaughter," I said. She consulted her computer screen. "I don't see you listed. You'll need approval from his daughter, Carmen Reyes Castillo." The hypohenated name made my stomach turn. Mom had never used Rick's name before, not until it was convenient for legal documents. "Can I at least know how he's doing? Has he been sick? Is he eating?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "Look, honey, I'm not supposed to say anything, but your grandfather, he asks about you every day. Asks when Maya is coming to take him home." I had to excuse myself to the parking lot to cry. Janet filed the emergency petition that Tuesday, April 2nd, 2016. We requested an immediate mental evaluation, a freeze on all assets, and restoration of Grandpa's legal rights. We also filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services, alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. While we waited for the court date, I took a leave of absence from school and moved into a cheap motel in Sacramento. I spent my days gathering evidence: bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals, witness statements from neighbors, records of Grandpa's perfect credit and independent living right up until February 2016. Mrs. Perez became our strongest ally. She'd saved everything: grocery lists in Grandpa's handwriting, receipts showing he'd been buying his own medications, photos from the neighborhood holiday party where he'd been alert and engaged. She even had security camera footage of him working in his garden just days before Carmen arrived with the papers. "That man was sharper than people half his age," she told Janet during her deposition. "He balanced his checkbook by hand every month, never missed a doctor's appointment, fixed my garbage disposal in January. If someone convinced him to give up everything, they lied to him." The case moved slowly through the system. Every day that passed was another day Grandpa sat in that place, wondering why his family had abandoned him. I tried calling the facility daily, but was told repeatedly that he could only receive calls from approved contacts. Meanwhile, Carmen and Rick had disappeared. Their last known address was an apartment in Reno that they'd apparently vacated in late March. They'd left no forwarding information, no way to serve them with papers. It was Miguel who finally tracked them down. He'd hired a private investigator, a former cop named Tony Valdez who specialized in missing persons. "Found them in Phoenix," Tony reported in May. "Living in a gated community, driving new cars. Your mother's got a credit card with a $50,000 limit. Looks like they're living pretty well on the old man's money." The court hearing was scheduled for June 14, 2016. Judge Patricia Williams was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd seen too many cases like ours. Carmen and Rick showed up with an expensive lawyer from Phoenix, both of them tanned and dressed in clothes that cost more than I made in a month. I hadn't seen my mother in over a year, and the transformation was jarring. Her hair was professionally colored, her nails perfect, her handbag probably worth more than my car. She looked right through me as if I were a stranger. Their attorney, a smooth man named Bradley Hutchins, argued that Antonio had been suffering from early-stage dementia, that Carmen had acted out of love and concern for her father's well-being, that the facility was top-rated and appropriate for his needs. My client made difficult but necessary decisions to protect her father from his own declining cognitive abilities, Hutchins said. The power of attorney documents were properly executed, with witnesses present. Mr. Reyes understood exactly what he was signing. Janet stood to respond, and I felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who barely knew us, but had worked tirelessly for months on our behalf. "Your Honor, we have extensive evidence that Mr. Reyes was mentally competent and functioning independently right up, until the moment his daughter and her boyfriend convinced him to sign away his rights. We have medical records, witness statements, photographic evidence, and financial records showing a man who was fully capable of managing his own affairs." She presented Mrs. Perez's testimony, the security footage, bank records showing regular, responsible transactions. She showed photos of Grandpa's well-maintained garden, his organized home, his careful notes and lists. "This isn't a case of a loving daughter protecting her father," Janet continued. "This is a case of predators who saw an opportunity and took it. They promised Mr. Reyes that signing these papers would make things easier for him, that they would help him maintain his independence. Instead, they used his trust to rob him of everything he'd worked for." The medical evaluation, conducted by Dr. Watson, was damning for Carmen and Rick's case. Dr. Watson found Grandpa to be cognitively intact, with no signs of dementia or diminished capacity. Her report noted that he was clearly distressed by his current situation and expressed consistent, coherent concerns about the circumstances that led to his institutionalization. But it was Grandpa's own testimony that broke my heart and sealed the case. Judge Williams had ordered that he be brought to court to testify. When he walked into the courtroom, shuffling, thinner than I remembered, wearing clothes that didn't fit, I barely contained my sobs. He looked directly at me first, his eyes lighting up with recognition and relief. "My Amija, you came. I've been trying to get to you for months, Grandpa," I whispered. When he took the stand, his voice was steady but sad. He explained how Carmen had visited him regularly in early 2016, bringing food and spending time with him. She said she was worried about me getting older, living alone. Said there were programs that could help, make sure my bills got paid automatically, make sure I wouldn't lose the house if I got sick. His voice cracked. She said she loved me, that she wanted to take care of me like I'd taken care of her when she was little. Did you understand that you were signing over complete control of your assets to your daughter? Janet asked gently. Grandpa shook his head. She said it was just paperwork, that I'd still live in my house, still have my things. She said it was just to make sure everything was protected. When did you realize what had actually happened? When the men came with the truck. When they started taking my furniture, my tools, Rosa's pictures. I asked Carmen what was happening, and she said it was temporary, that they'd find me somewhere better to live. But then, he looked across the courtroom at my mother, who was staring at her hands. Then she stopped visiting, stopped calling. I haven't seen her since the day they took me to that place. Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment after Grandpa finished testifying. Then she looked directly at Carmen. Miss Reyes Castillo, would you like to explain to this court why your father is living in a substandard facility while you're residing in a gated community in Arizona? Carmen's lawyer whispered something to her, but she stood up anyway. For a moment, I thought she might actually show some remorse, some recognition of what she'd done. Instead, she said, "He's old, he needed help. I was just trying to do what was best for everyone." Everyone? Judge Williams raised an eyebrow. Or just yourself? The ruling came down 3 days later. Judge Williams found that Antonio Reyes had been fraudulently induced to sign over his assets through misrepresentation and false promises. She ordered the immediate reversal of all property transfers, the return of all liquid assets, and the payment of damages for emotional distress and inadequate care. More importantly, she ruled that Carmen and Rick had committed elder abuse and financial exploitation, and she referred the case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. But perhaps most satisfying was her final order. Given the defendant's demonstrated willingness to exploit and abandon Mr. Reyes, this court finds it necessary to issue a permanent restraining order. Carmen Reyes Castillo and Rick Castillo are prohibited from contacting Antonio Reyes in any form and are banned from any involvement in his care or financial affairs. I drove to Modesto that afternoon to bring Grandpa home. He was sitting in his room, a bare space with a narrow bed and a plastic chair, staring out the window at the parking lot. When he saw me, he stood up slowly and opened his arms. "I knew you'd come, Mija. I never stopped believing you'd come." We cried together for a long time. The house was gone, sold to one of Rick's associates for half its market value, but Janet was working to reverse that sale through the courts. In the meantime, I found us a small apartment in Sacramento's Oak Park neighborhood, close to Mrs. Perez and the community Grandpa had known for decades. It wasn't the same as having his own home, but it was a start. Grandpa adapted to apartment living with more grace than I expected. He set up a small container garden on the balcony, growing tomatoes and peppers in pots. Mrs. Perez visited often, bringing homemade tamales and gossip from the old neighborhood. Miguel came by every Sunday with his family, and soon the apartment filled with the sounds of children playing and adults laughing, the sounds of family that had been missing for too long. I transferred to Sacramento State to finish my nursing degree, and Grandpa insisted on walking with me to campus when the weather was nice. "Education is the one thing they can never take from you," he'd say, just like he had when I was a child. The criminal case against Carmen and Rick moved forward slowly. They'd fled Arizona by the time the arrest warrants were issued, but Tony Valdez eventually tracked them to Las Vegas, where they were living in a cheap motel and apparently running out of stolen money. They were arrested in September 2016, charged with elder abuse, grand theft, and conspiracy. Carmen's mug shot showed a woman I barely recognized, the expensive clothes and perfect hair replaced by a county jail jumpsuit and hollow eyes. Part of me expected to feel satisfaction when I saw that photo. Instead, I just felt empty. This was the woman who'd given birth to me, who'd once braided my hair and sung me to sleep. Somewhere along the way, she'd chosen money over love, convenience over family. Grandpa never wanted to attend the trial. "I don't need to see her in chains," he said quietly. Carmen and Rick both took plea deals rather than face trial. Carmen got 3 years in state prison. Rick got 5. They were also ordered to pay full restitution, though Janet warned us we'd probably never see that money. People like that don't hold on to money, she explained. They spend it as fast as they steal it. She was right. By the time they were arrested, most of Grandpa's savings were gone, spent on cars and clothes and a lifestyle they couldn't afford. We recovered about $30,000, a fraction of what they'd taken, but enough to help with rent and medical expenses. The house was a different story. It took almost 2 years, but Janet finally succeeded in reversing the fraudulent sale. The court ordered Rick's business associate to return the property, though it was in terrible condition by then. The new owners had stripped out the appliances and flooring, apparently planning to flip it quickly. "Do you want to move back?" I asked Grandpa when we walked through the empty, damaged rooms. He was quiet for a long time, standing in what used to be his kitchen, looking out at the backyard where weeds had overtaken his carefully tended roses. "No, Mija," he said finally. "Too many ghosts here now, but maybe we can fix it up, sell it properly, use the money for something good." We did exactly that. With help from Miguel and some of Grandpa's old friends, we spent the summer of 2018 renovating the house. It was therapeutic work, repairing what had been broken, restoring what had been damaged. When we sold it that fall, Grandpa insisted on giving quarter of the proceeds to a nonprofit that helped elderly victims of financial abuse. "Money comes and goes," he said, "but helping people, that lasts forever." I graduated from nursing school in December 2018 and took a job at UC Davis Medical Center specializing in geriatric care. Grandpa was my proudest supporter, attending my graduation ceremony in a suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion. "My granddaughter, the nurse," he'd tell anyone who would listen. "She's going to help people, just like I always knew she would." The years that followed were some of the best of my life. Grandpa's health remained good, and our small apartment became a gathering place for the family and friends who'd stood by him during the worst of times. Mrs. Perez practically lived there some weeks, and Miguel's children called him Tata and begged for stories about the old days. We never heard from Carmen again after her release from prison. She'd served 26 months of her 3-year sentence and disappeared into whatever life awaited people who'd burned every bridge behind them. I used to wonder if she ever thought about him, ever regretted what she'd done. But Grandpa seemed to have found a peace that didn't require her remorse. "Some people carry love," he told me one evening as we sat on our balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "And some people carry emptiness. Carmen carries emptiness now, and that's punishment enough." In 2022, I decided to go back to school for my master's degree in social work, specializing in elder advocacy. I wanted to help other families navigate the legal and emotional complexities of elder abuse, to be the voice that Grandpa almost didn't have. "You're following your heart," he said when I told him about my plans. "That's what Rosa would have wanted. She always said you had healing hands and a fighting spirit." I was accepted into the MSW program at Sacramento State and threw myself into the coursework with the passion of someone who'd seen injustice up close. My thesis focused on improving early intervention systems for financial elder abuse, using our case as a framework for understanding how quickly trust could be weaponized against vulnerable adults. Grandpa lived to see me graduate with my master's degree in May 2024. He was 86 then, still mobile but moving more slowly, still sharp but sleeping more often. We celebrated at his favorite Mexican restaurant, surrounded by the chosen family we'd built over the years. "I'm proud of you, Mija," he said that night, holding my diploma with hands that shook slightly. "Not just for the degree, but for who you've become. You turned pain into purpose." 3 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in June, I found him in his favorite chair on the balcony, surrounded by his thriving tomato plants, looking peaceful in the early morning light. He'd passed in his sleep, just as he'd always hoped he would, at home, surrounded by love with dignity intact. The funeral was exactly what he would have wanted: mariachi music, stories shared in both English and Spanish, Mrs. Perez's tamales, and more flowers than the chapel could hold. People came from all over Sacramento: former coworkers, neighbors from the old house, patients from the hospital where I worked who'd heard about the man who'd raised a granddaughter to fight for justice. Miguel gave the eulogy, talking about a man who'd worked with his hands but lived with his heart, who'd faced betrayal without becoming bitter, who'd taught us all that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. I scattered half his ashes in the garden behind his old house with the new owner's permission, a young family with small children. The new owners had restored the roses, and they were blooming brilliantly that day, red and pink and yellow against the green of summer. The other half I keep in a simple wooden box on my mantel, next to a photo of him teaching me to plant seeds in his backyard when I was 7 years old. Both of us have dirt under our fingernails and huge smiles on our faces. I still live in that apartment in Oak Park, though I've expanded into the unit next door. Every morning, I wake up in the apartment we shared, make coffee the way he taught me, strong and sweet, and sit on the balcony among the plants he'd started. The tomatoes still grow there, passed down through generations of seeds, and every summer they produce fruit that I share with neighbors who need fresh vegetables, and a reminder that some things endure. The sun rises over Sacramento, painting the sky in colors that would have made him smile, and I remember what he told me the day we won our court case. Mija, they tried to erase me, but you wouldn't let them. And now look, I'm still here, still growing things, still loving people. That's how you win. Not by destroying the people who hurt you, but by refusing to let them destroy what matters. I carry his words with me every day, in my work with families facing their own betrayals, in the community we've built around his memory, in the seeds I plant each spring in honor of a man who taught me that love isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who chooses to water your garden when everyone else walks away. The tomatoes are almost ready for harvest now. Mrs. Perez and I will can them next week, like we do every year, making salsa and sauce that will feed our chosen family through the winter months ahead. And somewhere in that ritual of preservation and sharing, Grandpa lives on, not in the house that was taken from him or the money that was stolen, but in the love we choose to plant, tend, and pass on to the next generation of people who need to know they're not alone in the world. That's the legacy worth keeping. That's the story worth telling. That's the victory that can never be taken away. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button. And don't forget to share this video and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got more incredible revenge stories coming your way. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace with toxic family members or standing up for what's right? What would you have done in Maya's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.